Assistant Director for Programs at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities and Cultural Heritage. I will turn this over to Susanna Turbay in just a minute, but before I do, I just wanted to read a land acknowledgement. I'd like to address the issue of the land that Brown University and that this department occupies. Before we begin, a process has been underway over the last 6 months at Brown to create a meaningful acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and their connections to this land. This process will take time, deliberation, and care to ensure that this acknowledgement follows Indigenous protocols and addresses meaningful action. As this work continues with the guidance of our colleagues at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative, it's important to acknowledge this center's role in displacement, to name the violence that has been done to this land, to people, and to non-human inhabitants, and to acknowledge that this displacement and violence continue to this day. Thank you for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Susanna, who will be introducing Rob. Take it away, Susanna.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I am Susanna. Thank you, Robert, for being here and sharing about your work. I'll do a quick introduction. So Robert Blackson is the co-director of curatorial programs and curator of citywide initiatives at Philadelphia Contemporary. From 2011 to 2020, he served as the founding director of Temple Contemporary, a research and public program initiative whose top signature projects included Symphony for a Broken Orchestra, Funeral for a Home, and Reform, a project with the artist Pepón Osorio and the Fairhill community. He has also worked as a curator for public programs on Nottingham Contemporary in the United Kingdom and the curator of BALTIC Centre for Contemporary Art and the Newcastle and Gateshead in the United Kingdom as well. His writings have appeared in numerous monographs and journals, including Art Journal, Labyrinth, and Cabinet. He is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design and Bard College's Center for Curatorial Studies. He currently serves on the board of Sky Collective Isles of Skye in Scotland. I would like to begin this talk by asking you, Robert, we talk in public humanities about the role care plays in the practice and how does caring look in curatorial practice and in the work of people who work with communities. So I would like to ask you if you could share more about the role that this sense of care plays in the programs you have done over the past years, and how does care reflect in those? And if you can share more about the programs.
Thank you, Susanna, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for inviting me here to speak with you this afternoon. It's a great leading question to talk about care. And perhaps it's a bit cliche or perhaps academic to talk about curatorial practice in relationship to care, because the etymology of the word to curate, its root stems from the idea curator, which is to care for something. And it's a connection that I take very seriously as a curator, because I feel as though, at least within many strands of curatorial practice, the care is attached to objects. You know, how are we looking after an object so that it can retain its status into perpetuity, or its materiality into perpetuity? And I come at this work from a different angle, which is about relationships between individuals and between people. And I tend, as much as possible, to avoid the word community in my work, only because I feel sort of having learned from the art historian and theorist Kobina Mercer, that the idea of a community is as much inclusive as it is exclusive. And I've found the most valuable strands of my practice to be enriched through personal connections and personal relationships that are in some cases built over years. So it can take a long time to get some of these projects into development and into fruition and implementation, simply because the care isn't mutual or isn't reciprocal. And when that's the case, the project often falls quite flat, or doesn't happen at all. So to build up a genuine and sometimes authentic relationship to care, it does take that level of conversation and vulnerability, which is some people just can't go there. And that's just something to respect and to kind of move on from. And if you like, I can share a program or two with you all to try and tease that out a little bit, and just see if I'm communicating the care that I take effectively. Do you guys understand how it works? And yeah, I'll start with a project and then we'll go a little bit deeper. I don't know if I can see. I could do. Now that you started off with this question, I'm sort of questioning the presentation that I created for this afternoon. Maybe what I should do is talk first about a project that I wasn't going to highlight, but now I think I will, called Symphony for Broken Orchestra, which you did mention in your introduction. Symphony for Broken Orchestra began out of a question that was raised by an advisory council that I've created. And I know when I say the words advisory council, it starts to a little bit of an eye roll, because it's often seen as a bit of a smokescreen. Like, yeah, we'll create an advisory council, but then we're going to do what we really want to do. And we'll just have these advisors sort of in the background to provide some protection for the curatorial interests that are sort of in keeping with just one person. And the structure of the advisory council that I've created is one that there are 30 members on it. They come from many different walks of life within the city of Philadelphia. So some of them are elders, some of them are students, some of them are civic and cultural leaders throughout the city. And I've selected them quite carefully after years of conversations with individuals. And their homework assignment is really just to come up with one question that they each care very much about, but that they do not know the answer to. And so we receive over the years all kinds of questions. A question I remember receiving once was about how is it that half of the world's population goes through menopause, but yet it's so rarely talked about in many circles. And so these are questions that I, as a cis white guy, would never have come up with. But the way that the advisory council is structured is that when they bring their questions, when the advisors bring their questions to the meeting, they all come around a table and they ask their question, and their question is debated by the other advisors. And at the end of that meeting, they vote on which question that was raised they feel has the greatest local relevance and international significance. And it's through that voting process that I literally carve up the budget that I have available to me to try to address those questions in the same priority in which the advisors determined. And to make this visual, and to get you guys to stop looking at my face, how about I'll share my screen just quickly so you can see what it is that I'm talking about here. So let me, I think it's this one. Okay, so can you guys see? It looks like it's like the letters YAC. Can you see that? Is that what you're looking at? Cool. So I'll just burn through these to show you quickly this. And I'm going to leave it on presentation mode just because I think it's easier to navigate for you all to see. But if you can sort of look at that a little carefully, this is how an advisory council works. So these are questions like urban gardens or waste and litter, or what do we do about soil? These are questions that were raised by the advisors themselves. And this is then how I carve up my budget accordingly, to being like, okay, we're going to be doing a lot about soil this year because that's an interest of the advisors. And then when an advisory council begins a question, and I'll just go back up to the top here so we can get to a project that I think I should talk about first, considering.
Hey, Rob, can I ask one quick thing? Could you click the X over design ideas? So maybe that'll, in the screen will get a little larger so we can see more detail on what's being shown.
Sure, design.
Over in the right-hand column, like next to your slide, there's design ideas.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I didn't even know that was, I didn't see that was there, sorry.
That's great, thank you. Sorry, yeah, we can get more detail on the slide that's up.
Okay, so I'll just go back down to that one so you can see a little bit better because I didn't realize that was being keeping you from seeing more of it. And I'll put it on presenter mode too, so you can see more of that. And when the advisors, when they raise these questions, they do it obviously from that position of care, and something that they do want to take forward. And so having that sense that this is beginning from a purpose that is not my own, it sets me up as a curator with an interesting homework assignment, really, which is to research that question and to talk in deeper relationships with the advisory council, and then allow them to steer me as to how to best try to address that question or answer that question in service to them. So I'm trying to immediately, as much as possible, flip the dynamic between this sort of like often white dude, like all-knowing, all-seeing, all-traveled sort of perspective, and flip it back to the advisors that I think know this city much better than I do. I've only been here for 10 years, and also come from many different perspectives. And so if it's a person who's elderly who's asking me questions about something, and then there's someone who's younger who wants to vote for that same question, immediately I have this sort of balance of perspectives, multi-generational often, multiracial often, that help to sort of widen out my expectations and understandings of what this question actually embodies as it relates to the city. In a way that this kind of process has come to fruition is, one of them anyway, is that a couple years ago, the Philadelphia School District decided that they needed to close about a third of the public schools across the city. And this, as you can probably imagine, is a sort of a monumental decision that has innumerable, probably infinite repercussions for the communities that those neighborhood schools were serving. And if you looked at the demographics and the economy of the decision, you can easily and quickly tell that the schools that were most heavily targeted were the schools that were in low-income neighborhoods. So it was a very challenging decision, and it was one that the advisors brought to this process. And one of the advisors asked the question, if the walls of a closed public school could speak, what would they say? And it's as poetic and as mysterious as that are sometimes these questions. But it got the bulk of the questions that the advisors were raising. And now I feel like I should do, I'm going to go to this first slide to show you how we tried to address this question and through the process. And it prompted myself and our associate director at Temple Contemporary at the time to tour all of those closed schools of Philadelphia. And we walked into this closed gymnasium, and it was really a warehouse for all of these mostly broken pianos that the school district at the time was warehousing, that were collected from all of these closed schools. And it begged the question, like, how many broken instruments in these schools are there? And so we began to count them, and we came up with what turned out to be over 1,000 broken instruments throughout the city of Philadelphia. And so we collected those instruments, and we actually listened to those instruments and tried to find a way that we could uplift those students' care for those instruments in a way that hadn't yet happened. And so you can see here in this image the way in which we tried to work that through. So all of these instruments that you're seeing here in this slide came to Temple University, where I was working at the time. And you can see, if I can just move this along, that these instruments were just completely kind of busted up. And what I was doing as a curator was trying to find the ways to properly care for these instruments in the future. And so this is, literally you open up a flute case and this is what you find inside. And to try and share this idea of the caring and the possibilities that come with it, we took those broken instruments and we basically made an installation of them in the gallery where I was working at the time, just so that the city of Philadelphia could literally see the problem. Because what had happened previously is that these broken instruments, lived in the basement of a school or in the back closet, but they weren't seen in totality. And so by showing them all, people realized like, wow, there's actually a whole lot here. And then through the recordings, we made a website and made it available for the public to listen to the sounds that the broken instruments can make, find out a little bit more about the history of that instrument. Some of these instruments were literally antiques. And through that, there was an adoption process. And we raised hundreds of thousands of dollars through grants and individual giving to try and repair these instruments. We commissioned the Pulitzer Prize winning composer David Lang to make a composition specifically for the sounds that these broken instruments could make. So David trolled through hundreds of audio files to find out, for example, what that clarinet could do, or what that trumpet could do, or what that violin could do, and then wrote a composition accordingly that was then played by a paid orchestra of hundreds of musicians, including the Mummers of Philadelphia, professional musicians from the Philadelphia Orchestra, or just kids and their grandparents who are learning how to play. And they were each given a broken instrument and the composition, and then they all showed up to collect that instrument and then to play it for the city. And so we had sold out performances, 2 sold out performances that we did for this composition. But then after that process, where we played the broken instruments for the city, we started the hard work, which was it sounds like all this was lead up really to actually repairing those instruments and taking them back to the schools the following summer. So all those instruments were repaired and taken back to the schools where they came from, and they each came with a little tag that identified them as being part of the project. So everybody knew that this was one of the instruments that came through that process. And thankfully now, as a result of all those donations, that the School of Philadelphia now has a kind of a war chest of funds to continue for the foreseeable future to be able to repair broken instruments throughout the district. This is an image of another concert that took place in Israel, because this idea took off and is now being, new broken instruments are everywhere. And so this is a concert that was taking place in Jerusalem, again, with broken instruments through the neighborhoods and musicians that were aware of where the repositories of broken instruments resided. And I guess I'm sharing this image in one way, just to share that, these people performing here in Israel had no idea about the question that was raised through the advisory council process. They just, wanted to find a new way to fix their instruments. And that sense of opaqueness that I'm kind of sharing here between one idea and another and how it can be translated, I think gets in some ways to the root of this idea of caring, because it's been asked of me many times, like, you raised the money, you could have just fixed these instruments. You didn't have to create a website. You didn't have to create a concert. You didn't have to do all of those things that you did. But I don't think that would have really been to care for this project the way that I thought it was necessary. And what I mean by this is to just go ahead and fix them would have inspired so many hundreds of people to have donated their time or donated their musical services or donated their skills at fixing instruments or donated money, quite literally, to this process. There was something that we embedded in there that made people care enough about it, that turned it into the process that it became. And I think that is something that's fundamental and foundational to an appreciation of care that I think all curators need to expect to embody and to make it reciprocal. Because without that sense of the care being translated between groups of people and individuals and objects and experiences, I think you get pretty kind of a paper exercises that just fills space. I mean, I've worked for galleries and museums that simply do need to fill galleries. Like, we've got an empty month and we need a show, and they put a show up and someone might breeze through, but it doesn't really enlist that sense of under the skin need that I'm hopeful that we could do with more of our curatorial ambitions. And maybe I appreciate that we were supposed to have like a half an hour to do questions and a half an hour to talk about projects and programs. So maybe what I'll do is I will just, I'm going to talk about two more projects briefly. I'll talk about this project. So this is a project that I just recently completed called Double Rainbows. And I'm not sure what it was like in Providence, but at the early stages of the pandemic here in Philadelphia, many homes started to put the kind of the drawings or the paintings of children of rainbows in windows. And again, I don't know if that happened in Providence or not, but it definitely happened in a big way in Philly. And those drawings and paintings, some of them weren't that big, but it was definitely a unifying kind of situation, I felt. But after, I would say, August, September of 2020, they started to disappear from the windows. I think, the tape failed, or, the kid just wanted their drawing back, or I'm not sure what happened, or the parent got bored of it and took it down, but they started to disappear. And I was thinking, there's something here that is a voice. And so we started a process of collecting them. And we were able to get a database of where the majority of the houses where they were. So we reached out to them by mail and said, if you would like to donate your rainbow to this project, which we call Double Rainbows, we will find a way to gift this rainbow to a family who's lost a loved one to COVID. And so we started that. I'm not sure if this is going to advance or not. So we did a little exhibition at the Children's Museum here in Philadelphia, and then we started giving them. And so this is a family who lost their grandmother to COVID, and that's the rainbow that we were able to give to the family there, hanging on the wall. This is another one. This woman lost her husband, and that's the rainbow that was gifted to her through the process. And again, this idea of care. I mean, this was, as you saw in those images, it was a very small exhibition that we did at the Police Art Museum, very humble. So it didn't have the grandness maybe of the Symphony for a Broken Orchestra project that I mentioned earlier, but just this sense of one-to-one of, this family reached out, they wanted a rainbow, they wanted us to know about the man who died. They wanted to show us that they wanted to put it up in their house. And just that sense of the exchange became really important and kind of poetic, I think, for many families who were struggling with how to cope and getting a sense of communion with others in that moment. So yeah, just wanted to share that. And then the last project that I want to talk about, if we have a little bit of time, would be, and I have to jump into another PowerPoint, because this project I'm about to talk with you about hasn't really been, I haven't really packaged it in some respects, to be honest with you guys. So it doesn't really exist in the way in which these other projects I've already talked about. This is kind of a different one. So I'm going to share screen again to get over to that one. Okay. So are you seeing like my very full tab email system here? And I'll put this on presenter view as well. Okay, so you guys can see that okay? So thank you. And this project is called 100 People Listening. And it again began with the advisory council. So an advisor, a young African-American student named Destiny Palmer. And you can probably see her name just a little bit there in that sort of very bottom root of this tree. And she asked the question in an advisory council meeting, are we listening? And she asked that question because she asked that question in January of 2017, just after the 2016 election. And, she was so sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win that presidential election. And all the polls that she saw and all the social media that she was following was telling her that news. But then when the election count came back and Trump had won, she was like, how is this possible? And it encouraged her, inspired her maybe to ask this question, are we listening? Because it proved to her, that result proved to her that she was kind of listening in a bit of an echo chamber, and she was looking for a way out. And so that question got the majority of votes from the advisors, and then started this process again for me of like listening. Okay, are we listening? How am I going to tackle this? And we ended up at this project with 100 Philadelphians who are complete strangers to one another, selecting them from 5 different organizations across the city, like a homeless shelter, a back to work scheme, a Head Start program within the school district, a school for doctors, and a religious organization, to recruit individuals from their communities, and then just other random people from Philly who've gravitated towards this same question. And we've paired those individuals, these strangers, and these strangers are willing to, it's kind of crazy, they are willing to meet one another one day a year for 10 years. And they're doing this because we've all agreed that you could do this kind of experiment once and feel as though like, oh, I kind of got it. But doing it for 10 years, which seems like just over the crest of what we could truly expect or know, they're willing to sort of like jump into that unknown with a stranger together. So they may have political, religious, cultural beliefs that they hold now, but those might shift over a decade. And they're willing to sort of be that mirror for their partner as they reflect on how they're shifting, and trying to listen to one another. So there are tutorials that we have 5 listening advocates who are professionally trained in how to listen empathetically or actively to other individuals. And so each of the 100 people has assigned to them an advocate who's touching in with them 4 times a year. Like, how's it going? What's challenging you? What's working for you? All those kinds of things, so that each of these 100 people can become their best listener. And they're also given, I should just pull one out. They're also given, I appreciate you not able probably to see what I'm doing here, but they each have a group of 10 notebooks, one for every year, and they have to enter into these notebooks year on year just how their process of listening is developing. So the notebooks kind of look like this, and they all have different sort of statements within them. And every year they have to fill out a new one as they can talk about how their perspective on listening is changing. There's also a way in which the Free Library of Philadelphia is holding all of these notebooks, which will eventually be 1,000 notebooks in 2031, so that these books can be archived into the library for perpetuity. So as people begin to think about, well, how is this changing? How are we understanding ourselves years on from now? And thinking about this divisive time in our country and culture, hopefully these 1,000 notebooks over the next 10 years are going to be able to be some kind of document to share how these 100 people are trying to navigate this very polemic time in our country. And the painting here to the right on my screen is will be made into a mural. And each of those, there's 100 leaves on this tree, and you can kind of tell that each of the branches belongs to a different one of those different advocates that I talked about earlier. So each each of the 100 people are signing. Actually, this week is the last week for signatures, and I'm going out to everybody's house and getting them to sign their painting individually. So they're signing the leaf, kind of like you would in a fractor contract, which is a Pennsylvania Dutch thing here, about contracts and illustration. And then it will be made into a mural and exist on a wall here in Philly for the next 10 years as a document of what we're doing publicly. These are just, if it will advance, I'm not sure if it will, but oops, not went too far. These are just some of the portraits of the people who are participating in the project. They were taken by the Mexican-American photographer Ada Trillo. Yeah. So I went over a little bit of time, but hopefully that gives you a sense. Sorry, I bring this project up and kind of had to switch PowerPoints and everything just so that you all got a sense of how I'm trying to approach care. Because in projects like Double Rainbows or Symphony for Broken Orchestra, the care was kind of designed maybe, or the opportunities for care were kind of designed by me, architecturally maybe. But with 100 people listening, I really have no clue. I don't know how many of these partnerships are going to last, how they're going to create that care between one another, which will hopefully make it last. It's really kind of on the deep end of, I don't really know where this is going to go, but that's kind of why we're doing it together. Yeah. So again, apologies for running over, but very interested to talk further about these or other. There's lots of other projects that I haven't talked about that I'm happy, like Funeral for Home or whatever, if we can get into those, or Reform or other projects that I've done, happy to.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing those projects and for all the knowledge that you have shared with us. And I would like to point out that the idea of establishing exchanges between people, between different mindsets, is the starting point to create relationships. And as you said, maybe doing things long term, and if not, just that first exchange of time, of knowledge, of thoughts creates an enriching relationship for different projects. I would like to ask people if you have questions. I'm sure what you've shared with us has sparked some interest. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask. You can also use the chat. And feel free to open your mics if you want to ask something.
So I see that I'm not how to pronounce this. Zena maybe has raised their hand.
Yeah, I just so you guys know, I just changed it so everyone is able to unmute themselves. So if you've got a question, you can voice it, or if you want, if you want us to go, you can use the chat. But yeah, I think Zena, I see your hand up.
Okay, great. Unmuted. Rob, it's Christina Alderman.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm living it.
Awesome to see you. I'm so glad you're here to share this. I wanted to ask a question about process, because in your working with your advisory group, voting seems like a really it's really interesting to me, because I'm like so scared of voting because I feel like it favors like just majority, but somehow it seems like you get the humans to a consensus, even though maybe they all don't vote the same, or things change and evolve. So I'm wondering how you build consensus through voting, and that people don't feel like one idea sort of like got more attention than others and they're passionate about it. Because it's yeah, I'm interested how you do that.
Yeah, so it's a good question, because there are some rules that I didn't go into depth earlier, but one of the rules is no project with just one vote moves forward because it doesn't have that sense of balance of multiple perspectives. So yeah, that's one thing that doesn't sort of, I don't take forward. But in this idea of consensus, and it does get as silly as breaking up the budget as how can I say this? Breaking up the budget as granularly as it looks on that pie chart. So there was like one slice of that pie that was about what makes people happy. And so that literally got, we did programming around that question, even though I think it only got 3 votes. But it was that sense of we gotta give something to everything here, as long as I had more than 1 vote. And the reason for that is I operate in a different way. This is just a luxury of the kinds of curatorial gigs I've had. I don't lock myself into an exhibition calendar. And that is kind of essential to the process. Because if I were to do that, I would probably end up kind of going with this idea of majority rule, where, okay, I've got 9 votes for this topic, and that's a majority, so that's what we're doing the show on. And because when, like you saw that pie chart earlier, everything was about soil, or a lot of the votes were about soil. And like, so I organized, like, well, I guess to use the right terminology, a fertilizer load of programming around soil, and nobody came. People literally didn't give a shit. And so that taught me, like, okay, we got to pivot here, because this is not, like, maybe people voted for it. Like the same thing happened with the Occupy movement and a couple other things that people got a lot of votes for. By the time we got around to like doing the thing that felt right, the moment had passed. And so there was a way within this that, because the votes kind of scatter, there's other things that the public thankfully does get interested in. So like the thing about the walls of the broken school, like that question was raised like a year and a half. And like I'm doing this listening project in 2021, and that question was raised in 2017. Like some of these things have a long baking time. And so that's kind of important, so that other things can come to the surface and there isn't this majority rule kind of mindset, and the public kind of votes with their butts in their seats about what it is that they think is still the conversation to be had. And so that's how the voting doesn't turn into just like, oh, well, you got the most votes for this, and so that's what you're doing. So for example, with the listening project or Funeral for a Home, the public just seemed like eager for this. And so it's like, okay, this thing with the instruments, the broken instruments is really taking off. People really seem excited about it. They like the idea. They want to talk more about it. This makes sense to make into a larger application, to make it into a grant possibility and those kinds of things. So it starts with the advisory council and then raising the questions, and then it develops into multiple conversations. And then you see which kind of conversations kind of gain their own momentum, and you just kind of hang on and try to guide it into a curatorial process of creating something. So thanks for that question, because it is a bit of a white knuckle ride. And I understand, Christina, your kind of your trepidation and your concern, because it's on 2 levels. It's one, like, is this going to muffle all the voices that did raise questions that didn't get as many votes as the main question? But the flip of that, if there is one, is just that what happens as a result can often not reach the nuance, and sometimes pretend to address something or solve something more than it really does. So yeah, it's some things to be concerned about, notwithstanding just a sense of, I am a curator and I have been trained and I do know how to do this. And all of a sudden they're voting for a question I know nothing about. So how the hell am I supposed to stay in charge when I don't know what I don't know the history enough? And that just sends me into like reading a ton of books and having a lot of conversations, and always holding the humbleness that I think is necessary within the curatorial profession, to be like, I'm working in service here, so help me out as we try to figure this out.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's nice to hear your voice.
Oh, it's great to hear yours.
Hi, Rob. I'm Kennedy Jones. I just want to thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And something I'm curious about is all of the works that you showed are just like living, breathing exhibitions, which I think is really amazing and have just a inherent need for like observers to be active in the work that you're doing. But I'm curious, just thinking about kind of the field you work in. I think there's like oftentimes departments divide themselves as like public programming and curation or art departments. I'm interested how in your practice, a lot of your work, the projects you explain, I think some people would push under public programming, and just I'm curious to understand how you understand your title as curator and also how that works in tandem or differently from someone that maybe works in public programming.
Right. Thanks for that question, Kennedy. I gotta say, I've been kind of blessed with some weird jobs. My first kind of real job was to curate, not my real job, but the first job where I was sort of like, oh, I'm kind of doing this, was to be the curator of a small university gallery. So there was always an educational slant to that because there was always students around, there was always curriculum to tie into if I needed to. And I've also been the curator of public programs, as you rightly suggest, would probably be a good fit for me. And then I worked for a very long time at an art school, undergrad, grad kind of situation. So it's kind of been like sewn into me at every possible place that you have to think about how this is going to reach not necessarily a wider audience, but how is it going to be meaningful and like sort of push the ball forward in a sense. And so that has always been something that I've struggled with. And now that I'm the co-director of this curatorial program at Philadelphia Contemporary, and I've changed from being in the academic setting to being in the public realm, curatorially, I've had the good fortune of having to create or co-create a department. And so recently we hired a curator of education, and there was thankfully with the rest of my team, an easy conversation that this curator of education should not live in an education department and have their own sort of like, I work in service to the curators and I try to come up with an evening talk or an artist lecture or something like this, but they're actually as creatively invested in the responsibility is as much on them as it is on any of our other curators to come up with programming that relates in this way. And as I say, that was a very easy conversation, and something that we were all on board with. So I haven't had to have that tension, that unsavory connection, I would say, of trying to battle my corner to say why this is necessary to the institution. I've thankfully just had the good fortune of choosing places that see the curatorial value in these approaches, and then I come up with a way to honestly fill the space, which is as offhand as I mean it to be. Like, I really don't care about exhibition spaces. I really don't. And I think they're extremely problematic for all kinds of reasons. So I just do my best to create the programs that will be meaningful, and that hopefully others will think so as well, and that don't have to rely on this idea of the rarefied exhibition space that we are all so familiar with. Hi, Julia.
Hi. Sorry, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for this talk. The relational aspect of your work is so interesting and really just feels so generative. I'm wondering, as you mentioned, the Symphony for a Broken Orchestra has taken off, and it's being done in Israel and other places. And as your concept is being interpreted by other people, I'm just wondering, do they reach out? Do you provide them a handbook with instructions for how the project is done? And I also would imagine that the 100 Voices Listening project will also, take off in other places as well. So yeah, what are the collaborations that happen there, or how do people reach out and get direction for these projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I had to tackle pretty early on when I switched to this mode of curating, which relies on the questioning and the care. And I should add, and this is something that Christina knows, like I didn't come to this because I had this epiphany that I cared so much, or that I all of a sudden understood the etymology of the word curate that made me switch to this way. It really came because I was exhausted. I was kind of done with curating in the way that I had been up to that point, which at that point was about 7 or 8 years of curatorial practice, which revolved around finding the genius artist or the genius situation, and then giving it about 1,200 square feet to do something with, and some white walls and good lighting. It really came out of an exhaustion of working in that mode. But this idea, I guess I go there because what you're bringing up, Julia, is kind of not equating necessarily, but it's balancing that idea of exhibitions tour. So these ideas can tour, and there's a sort of a currency that gets traded around, especially in the art world and definitely within cities. And I would say that we did a project called Funeral for a Home a couple of years ago now, quite a few years ago, maybe 7, 8 years ago. And it involved just that. There was a home in West Philadelphia in the Mantua section that was being demolished. And so we unearthed the history of that home and who had lived there and what its relationship was to the neighborhood, and had everyone people who'd lived there and the families that owned it and all this kind of stuff, like be a part of this funeral procession, this funeral situation and meal. Soon thereafter, there was an organization in St. Louis that reached out to us and said, we want to do a funeral for a home here in St. Louis. Like, can you come out and we'll do this and all this kind of stuff. And it was really enticing. So like, yeah, let's like have funerals all over the world for homes that need to be pulled down. And then kind of step back a minute and thought like, no. Like, again, I'm this white guy who's, doing these projects, and I'm just one person. And these kind of projects take literally sometimes armies of people. And I'm not that person. I don't know St. Louis. I don't know how that would work. You all who live there, like the kernel of the idea. You do what you think is right. And the same thing is what happened in Jerusalem. So I didn't go there. I didn't prescribe that they had to set up an adoption system or set up a currency for getting the instruments fixed on a certain time scale, or say who needs to be involved and who shouldn't be involved, or any of that kind of stuff. If the idea is simple enough and is right enough for that moment, then it can be whatever it needs to be where it needs to be. I don't try to translate my authorship or whatever collaborative authorship I'm able to sort of hold to another place or a group of people, because I'm not living in that time anymore. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, it does. Thank you so much.
And when I say I don't live in that time anymore, I don't live in that time right now in terms of my own development.
Right.
Like that's the time I am right now in myself in terms of how I want to be with my projects, I shouldn't even call it my projects, but the projects that I've offered to you today. I may sort of develop into an understanding, and the me in 10 years is going to be like, no, I've seen this get screwed up too many times. Like, but right now I'm sort of like, it needs to find its own place with different people.
Right. And it sounds like it creates room for evolution and more, local and site specific types of art and relations to be produced. So thank you. I appreciate that response.
Yeah. I mean, truthfully, I'm having this conversation right now with Chicago. Chicago had an interest to tour Symphony for Broken Orchestra there. And we're in this dance of like, that would be great. Take it on, but also not knowing where I stop in this. Yeah. I guess I appreciate that people have to leave at 1, so let's try to squeeze in Kate if we can.
Hi, Rob. Thank you so much. This is super exciting to hear about your work. I work at Providence Public Library, and several of my colleagues in our programs and special collections are on the presentation today too. So,
oh, cool.
You are working right in line with sort of, I think, the approach that we're attempting to take and trying to sort of find our way through. And one of the questions I had was sort of around funding, and there's maybe sort of 2 sides to this question. One is when you're approaching funders, when about projects for which you don't have a defined answer, right? Because part of this whole process is so generative to sort of say, we don't exactly know what the end product will be, but trust the process. So what does that experience look like for you? And if you've got great strategies for helping them trust you, would be great to know. But the other sort of side of that coin is, you just mentioned a lot of these projects take a number of people to get off the ground and a lot of sort of coordinated effort. And does part of your funding structure include paying, for example, your advisory board members or the people in the community and your partners that you're working with to pull these kinds of larger scale projects off?
Great question. Great question. So on the nebulousness of approaching a funder without a thing, without a there, the listening project is a beautiful example. Like, okay, so you want like a lot of money. That project out of the gate is costing $360,000, of which everyone is getting paid. All those 100 people are getting paid and that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's coming down to trust, where thankfully they've seen this process work. And they took a leap of faith with me back when I did that, when I participated in the Funeral for a Home project. And that one went well. And they saw, because when I pitched Funeral for a Home, and a lot of these projects are funded by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, which is a major foundation here in Philadelphia, specifically for Philadelphia projects. We didn't know that the home was going to be in Mantua or what the home was going to be. So they kind of took a leap of faith based on the process that I was encouraging. And that worked out. And they've funded every project I've asked for since, and other foundations as well. So yeah, it's a lot about trusting the process. And some projects are a little bit more together than others. But I mean, 100 people listening is a beautiful example of like, I have no idea. But thankfully, people are trusting that something will happen. So they're going for it. Paying participants, I pay the strata. Currently, I'm paying the strata of the advisory council at the earliest level. So we have a youth advisory council, and they're paid to be a part of a weekly process of advising. But the elders and the civic and cultural leaders are currently not paid. We may change that to be $100 per meeting for incidental charges, like if someone needs childcare, if someone needs transportation, these kinds of things. And so we're getting to the point of actioning that, but that action can only happen once I haven't been at Philadelphia Contemporary for a year yet. So I wasn't able to do that payment structure within the system at Temple University. But I think now that I moved to Philadelphia Contemporary, I'll be able to pay the advisors in those additional 2 tiers of the civic and cultural leaders and the elders. So that is shifting, but it won't shift until I have my first meeting, which will be in the spring of 2022. Does that help with some of those questions about the payments and also the foundations? I got to say, I'm very, very fortunate in Philly to have things like the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, the William Penn Foundation, the Barrett Foundation, all of which have gotten behind these projects, which are really kind of, I don't know if not risky in the sort of like wear your seatbelt thing, but risky in the sense of like, what are we funding here?
Sorry, my mic. I was having trouble activating my mic. Thank you so much for your talk. We're short on time. We ran out of time, but I would like to thank you for sharing and having this space with us, and thank you all for being here.
Cool. Thank you very much. You guys are welcome to email me or ask questions later on. That's completely fine.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rob.
All righty. Bye-bye. See you, Christina.